Hello and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo Wine Info video, and today we are discussing the Mossop Introduction Chenin Blanc 2021, made of course by Cape Winemakers Guild member Mossop. Mossop made his mark in the wine world by spending almost 20 years as the head winemaker at the super high profile estate of Tokara in Stellenbosch's Hellswörter region. Now, Tokara went from being viewed by many as a sort of billionaire's pet project through to being seen as one of the most formidable and most respected fine wine establishments in South Africa. The Tokara brand is best known for its Bordeaux-style blends and Cabernet Sauvignons. So it's no surprise that when Mossop eventually left Tokara in order to strike out on his own and launch his own range of wines, his most acclaimed bottlings were made from Bordeaux cultivars from the Stellenbosch region. But Mossop is no one-trick pony, and so he has been able, in the last couple of years, to leave his little shire of Stellenbosch and venture out into the wild Swartland, where he began sourcing some really high-quality old vine Cinsault and Chenin Blanc. Now, this particular introduction Chenin Blanc is made from fruit that is sourced from both Stellenbosch and the Swartland. Initially, it was made purely from old bush vines in the two regions, but more recently, as production has grown, he's also included some trellised Chenin Blanc vines as well. But it's also worth noting that every single parcel that goes into this wine comes from vines that are over 35 years old, which means that this could technically be a certified heritage vineyards wine or an old vine wine, which is really significant given that there are almost 22,000 bottles of this made each vintage. The 2021 vintage also, incidentally, marks the 10-year anniversary of this introduction Chenin. Now, when it comes to smelling and tasting what's in the glass, the nose on this guy may not be excessively generous, but one thing that it is supremely classic of what South African Chenin, if it can be one thing, should be. And I guess this makes sense when we're reminded that, as I said earlier, this is sourced from Swartland and Stellenbosch, two of the regions that produce almost all of South Africa's most lauded Chenin Blanc. So what are the bare-bone elements of a classic South African Chenin? Well, there's always going to be a hint of fresh peach fruit, and perhaps in this case some slightly dry tartar apricot notes, which of course are added to a sweet lighter honeysuckle floral element and a slightly phenolic touch of saltiness to it all. Perhaps then, as a bonus, and as admittedly it kind of comes and goes on this particular wine, one might hope for an ever so subtle, reductive, flinty riverstone type aroma. Now, on the palate, the significance of the peach and apricot becomes more obvious, because that sweeter peach fruit is set up against the tart, fresh acidity of the apricots, and perhaps even a touch of nectarine as well. And then through the core, there is that unmistakable, salty, flinty, stony element that makes the wine feel a heck of a lot more serious than it otherwise would. Finally, on the tail, that apricot element morphs into a kind of white citrus grapefruit note, which is really super refreshing and sets the drinker up for their next sip. Now, I've mentioned elsewhere that the 2021 vintage is in fact something of a milestone for the introductory Chenin, because it is the 10th vintage since its first release in 2012. So I got hold of winemaker Mossop and asked him to cast his mind back over the last decade to tell us about some of the things that might have changed in his winemaking over that time. Impressively, there were some things that haven't changed. First of all, every single grape that goes into the making of this wine comes from vines that are over 35 years old. As I mentioned earlier, technically eligible for certified heritage vineyard status. Secondly, even though his production has gone from 4,000 bottles to almost 22,000 bottles, every single component is still fermented with spontaneous fermentation or native yeasts only. One thing that has changed with the larger production is that some of the components are now fermented in stainless steel, where previously it was all concrete and old barrels. This stainless steel is all about creating parcels or components within the wine that have a far higher level of freshness. Freshness is really another way of saying acidity, but it's kind of what winemakers use to make acidity sound nicer. And speaking of this pursuit of acidity or freshness, there are a few other things that have changed. For starters, he started to harvest his grapes ever so slightly earlier in order to yield slightly lower sugar levels, which yield slightly lower alcohol levels and also yield slightly higher acid levels. Secondly, the wine goes into bottle more quickly, which means a little less time on the lees, and it reaches the market a little bit sooner. Finally, Mossop adds sulfur a little earlier in the process in order to prevent any malolactic fermentation from taking place. This means that, of course, you're going to have far more of the tartar malic acid and less of the richer elements that comes from the production of lactic acid, which of course will result in more freshness. Well, that's all we have time for today, but if you enjoyed the video, then please subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we publish 6 videos each month, and we talk about things like wine science or history or unusual cultivars or viticulture, and we also explore some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the dynamic South African winelands.